what I want to do is just give you an idea of where the play came from and what Shakespeare did to sort of make it a unique story. So the photograph is Inverness Castle. This is a real place, obviously, because it's a photograph. And Inverness is where Macbeth, this is his home, essentially. And the castle's been added to over the centuries, but it's been there for probably over 1,000 years. Right, so there's Inverness Castle. Let's get moving. So we're dealing here with Scotland, and of course that's the yellow part at the top there. And you can see England in the bottom, Wales, Ireland, both parts of Ireland. And if you look at Scotland, the yellow part, up at the top, there's an inlet from the North Sea, a big sort of wedge into Scotland. At the furthest point left of that wedge is where Inverness is. So that's where the play takes place, in the north part of Scotland. And there are some other locations as well, but that's where it takes place. If you're interested, London is at the bottom of the green part, the bottom right. That's the current city of London. Here's another image with some of the key things in the play, key places in the play. Dunsinane Hill will become very important later in the play. You can see that's just part of north of Edinburgh. Forres is where the opening battle is. So the play starts with a battle. Scotland's being invaded by the Norwegians, and you can just see Norway in the top right of the photograph there. So they sailed across and invaded, which was common at the time period, Viking invasions. It happened in England as well. So the opening battle there is Forres, and then there again is Macbeth's castle. And then another character, Macduff, who's an important character in the play too, his castle is in Fife, just near Edinburgh there. Fife is the home of St. Andrews, which is, of course, the home of golf, the very famous old course at St. Andrews, which, of course, wouldn't have been there when the events of this play happened. But and then Dunsinane Hill, which I've already pointed out, that's an important part where the play ends, actually. All right, so on to some of the more salient features or facts. So Macbeth was a real guy, or at least there was a real Macbeth. The guy in the play is a different sort of version of him, but he's based on a real guy, and his real name was Macbethad Mac Findlech, and I'm sure that I have completely mispronounced that. It's a Gaelic name. But that is the guy that the play is based on. He succeeded King Duncan I of Scotland, and Macbeth ruled Scotland from about 1040 to about 1057 AD. Unlike the play, though, the real Macbeth did not murder Duncan. In the play, Macbeth murders the king and takes his place. In reality, they were fighting, and Macbeth killed him in battle, which happened all the time, and it wasn't considered wrong or bad, or people were in a lot of battles and a lot of people died, and that's just kind of the way it was. And Duncan, of course, was a real king as well. He was Duncan the First, and he ruled from 1034 until 1040 when Macbeth killed him. So there you go. So it's based on a real scenario. Duncan the First, the real one, had a son named Malcolm, and he does also in the play. His oldest son is Malcolm. He has another son named Donalbain, who shows up briefly and then kind of disappears. After his father's killed, Malcolm, of course, fled to England because, as the son of the former king, he didn't want to be around because sons of former kings tended to die. So Malcolm fled. He later returned with an army and defeated Macbeth and took the throne and became Malcolm III of Scotland. Lady Macbeth, who's a key character in the play, was also based on a real person. She had the unfortunate name of Groch, which, yeah, I guess back then it wasn't such a bad thing. But, maybe we should bring that back. Maybe if one of you guys has a daughter, you can name her Groch. That's, yeah, maybe not. The Lady Macbeth of the play is basically an invention of Shakespeare's. We don't know anything about the actual Lady Macbeth apart from her name and some really minor facts. We know nothing of her personality, which is true of most women of that time period. They were kind of decoration, really. But in the play, Lady Macbeth is arguably one of, if not the most important character in a lot of respects. She is really the driving force behind her husband. You could say she wears the pants in that family, at least for the first half of the play. So back to the real Macbeth. The real Macbeth is, he's remembered as a good king. In the play, not so much, but in reality, we know something about him. We know that he was considered a fair ruler. He established many useful laws, and he encouraged the spread of Christianity in Scotland. You'll recall from our study of the history of English, in England, around this time period, around the year 1000, Christianity was really taking hold. Well, that was true of Scotland as well, and Macbeth was a real advocate of his people becoming Christians. We know that he was even invited to Rome on a pilgrimage to visit the Pope during a papal jubilee, and he did go. So that's a fairly good thing to have happen to you. It gives you a good reputation. We know that eventually, as I mentioned before, he was deposed by Malcolm III, but Malcolm came with an army led by a guy named Siward. Siward lived in Northumbria. He was an Earl of Northumbria. Northumbria is the northern part of England that borders Scotland. It's still called Northumbria. And Siward actually makes an appearance in the play as well. So the play does follow loosely the historical process. What it does is it really embellishes the characters and gives them a lot more personality. And this is what Shakespeare did. Shakespeare had a habit of, he'd take basic elements of a true story and then he would spice them up quite a bit and create often a brand new story, a very different story with a lot more interesting characters and subplots and intrigue and all these other things. So he kind of took the basic historical shape and filled in a lot of the gaps. So an example of this is in Macbeth. He added the witches. The witches play a key role in the play, and there's no evidence that Macbeth ever knew any witches, the real Macbeth, but he sure does in the play. In the play, Duncan is not killed in battle by Macbeth. In the play, Macbeth murders Duncan in cold blood while he's sleeping, and he does this so that he can take the throne. Lady Macbeth is a study in evil in this play. She is one of, if not the most memorably evil character in any of Shakespeare's plays. She is just a bad piece of work. And Macbeth has a buddy, Banquo, who's roughly his equal at the beginning of the play, and they're very close. They're both decorated soldiers, they're good friends, and that goes sideways pretty quickly when Macbeth decides that he wants to take the throne. Banquo is not on board with this, and he basically figures out that Macbeth is up to no good, and so Macbeth has to deal with Banquo. Things don't end well for Banquo in the play. They don't really end well for very many people, actually, but it is a tragedy. So why does Shakespeare change this basic story? Why does he add these characters? Why? And obviously, I mean, the obvious answer is because Shakespeare's version of Macbeth is way more interesting, and the real version would make a terrible play. That's always the main answer. But there was a political reason, there was a social reason for Shakespeare altering this story at the time that he was writing. Okay, so you need to remember a little bit about history. Shakespeare lived and worked under two English monarchs. The first was Elizabeth I. She died in 1603. So by the time Shakespeare came to write Macbeth, the monarch in England was James I. And James I was Scottish. He was born and bred and raised. He was actually James VI of Scotland before he was James I of England. And so the first thing, the witches in the play, most scholars believe that they were added because James I was fascinated with the occult, and he was particularly fascinated with witchcraft, as were a lot of people at this period in history. Christianity took hold, and then all things satanic and demonic became, by default, um, rather interesting. We also know that James wrote and published a book about witchcraft, necromancy, and a number of other sort of shadowy practices, which he titled Demonology. And that book you can still get it probably online, although I don't imagine it's a very easy read. The other thing about James is his kingship was controversial, and not so much because he was controversial, but because he was Scottish. And English people had never had a Scottish king, and the relationship between England and Scotland has historically not been one of friendship, or they didn't really get along too much, and this has been going on for hundreds of years. So, in the late 1200s, you had Edward the First, who was known as the Hammer of the Scots. So he was the guy that fought Robert the Bruce and William Wallace, if you've seen the movie Braveheart. So the fact that James was Scottish was a problem for a lot of English people, and so there was tension in the country having a Scottish king. This kind of came to a head in the early part of 1605, and there was something called the Gunpowder Plot. And the Gunpowder Plot was a Catholic attempt to kill the English King James and all the Protestant English nobility. And the plan was to amass a huge amount of gunpowder under the Parliament buildings. And the one day of the year when the king was allowed into Parliament, they would blow the whole place up, and they would eliminate the king, all the nobility, and all the ruling people in one fell swoop. And the idea would be then Catholics could come back in, take power, and England would be a Catholic country again. Don't forget, England had not been Catholic since Henry VIII abolished the Catholic Church in the 1530s. So obviously the Gunpowder Plot was discovered. The perpetrators of the plot were gruesomely executed and punished, but again, right, James was feeling vulnerable, right, because there was at least one active plot to kill him. There were actually others as well. So Shakespeare's writing at a time where there's tension, political tension in the country, and so he sees it as an opportunity to write a play that sort of endorses the king. So Macbeth, we know, was performed in 1605, 1606, and we think that it was probably written shortly before that, so shortly after the Gunpowder Plot. We're not entirely sure. We only have publication dates, so we don't know exactly when he wrote the play, but it's likely pretty near the date that it was published. So the play has a good guy named Banquo, and he remains a good guy throughout at least until he's killed. And in the play, he is, and you'll see this when you read it, this will make sense, but Banquo basically is the father of all future Scottish kings. That's what the play sets him up as. And so by default, imagine you're James the First watching this play about ancient Scotland, and the good guy in the play is basically named as your ancestor. So this makes you look good, right? Or at least that's the plan. It legitimizes Scottish nobility by showing a really good Scottish guy who stands up for what's good and right, and is, at least fictionally, the ancestor of the current king. So the idea is Shakespeare is trying to make James look good. Unfortunately, the problem is that Macbeth was also Scottish, and James was not sure which person. Was he supposed to be Banquo, or was he supposed to be the evil Macbeth? And so there was some ambiguity there, and James was a little offended by the play, and so it didn't work out the way Shakespeare had planned, and as a result, James had the play banned, and it wasn't performed for several decades, certainly not again in James's tenure as king, tenure as the King of England. So some other interesting tidbits about Macbeth, and we'll go back to the witches here, is there was a rumor that was started And it is that there's certain spells in the play and incantations. The witches are seen casting spells, and some of them you'll recognize if you ever watched Saturday morning cartoons with Bugs Bunny, when double, double, toil and trouble, cauldron burn, boil and cauldron bubble. I mean, that's in Bugs Bunny. I watched that when I was a kid. That's from Macbeth. And the rumor was that these spells were not made up by Shakespeare. They were stolen from actual witches' rituals. And the witches were angry that Shakespeare had stolen these things, and so they cursed the play and anyone who performed it. And so in order to avoid the curse, this is how this kind of tradition, this legend has come down. In order to avoid the curse, the name Macbeth cannot be said out loud in a theater for any reason, unless, of course, it's an actual line in the play. If you say, you can't even say the title of the play in a theater. So it's always referred to as the Scottish play. It's not called Macbeth. And the actors still do this. If you do say the word Macbeth by mistake in a theater, then you invoke the curse. And there's only one way to undo the curse if you invoke it. So I found this video on YouTube, and it is a humorous kind of history of this Macbeth curse.
Premiere night in 1606, the actor playing Lady Macbeth was struck down by a fever and died, forcing Shakespeare himself to fill the role.
My husband! This is a sorry sight.
I'm trying my best, sweetheart.
And then all hell broke loose. Half a century later, an actor playing Macbeth substituted a real dagger for a fake one. He then used it to kill Duncan in full view of the audience. As the years passed, the death toll steadily rose. In 1721, a group of actors were so enraged by a heckling nobleman in the audience that they physically attacked him.
You're absolutely terrible. Boo! Get off!
The nobleman later returned with some feudal retainers and burnt the theatre down. In 1936, Orson Welles included a genuine witch doctor in his voodoo production of the play. Theatre critic Percy Hammond slated the show. Within weeks, he was dead. Still not convinced? What about the unfortunate member of the audience who was struck by a prop during a fight scene? He suffered a massive heart attack and died on the spot. Or the Lady Macbeth who met a sticky end by sleepwalking into the orchestra pit. Even today, in the 21st century, many actors remain deeply superstitious. It is thought that even just uttering the name Macbeth is enough to invoke the curse, which is why it is customary to refer to the piece as the Scottish play.
For years I've always said the Scottish play, not because I really understood why, but because I thought I would be frowned upon by my fellow actors if I actually said the word in case it did bring bad luck.
If you have the misfortune to utter the name of the Scottish play, then you've got to lift the curse, because this is bad. Things could happen to the production. Dire physical consequences could befall you. It's imperative you lift it.
All right, then. Macbeth. Bugger.
Unfortunately, it's quite simple. You race off the stage, out of the theatre, spin 3 times, spit quickly on the ground, and then you utter the worst profanity you know, and you can stroll back into the theatre knowing the curse has been lifted.
So there you go, a little background on Macbeth, and right, we'll talk more about the play as we read. Have a good day.